In this presentation, we will be reviewing some of the learnings resulting from the investments in food safety regulatory capacity building programs. We know that over the last period, we have witnessed a number of investments aiming to enhance the capacity of a number of food control systems in a number of countries, in a number of regions of the world, acknowledging the importance of these regulatory functions in enhancing the food and agri-food production capacity, and to ensure essentially that investments in the development of food and agri-food industries is also supported and underpinned by the robust capacity of a food regulator. What I'm going to be trying to achieve through this short presentation is to review some of the successes, but also some of the areas of improvement in food regulatory systems as a result of these investments. And we're going to be focusing particularly on some of these areas of improvement, some of the learnings that we could get from the shortcomings in some projects that, in fact, I had the opportunity to be part of. And from there, hopefully, we'll draw some perspectives and some conclusions as a result of these observations. So let's start by looking at how some of these projects that aim to enhance food regulatory systems have been performing, and particularly the positive outcomes that it has resulted that some of these have resulted in. As I mentioned, in a number of parts of the world, we have witnessed investments in food regulatory capacity building. What do I mean in food regulatory capacity building? Basically, looking at the regulatory oversight in a country or in a region, identifying some gaps and addressing some gaps by either building the capacity, the competencies in a food safety regulatory authority, reviewing the legislative background, investing in the development of food laws, investing in the development of competencies, and that is really human competencies that will help support the implementation of food regulatory programs, but also looking at the structure of these food regulatory programs and re-engineering them in order to make them more adapted to address the needs of a given jurisdiction, and again, in most instances, to be able to accompany the development of a food and agri-food production sector. So looking at what has been really positive in some of these investments. In a lot of these investments, there is a strong emphasis on the fact that food safety is a shared responsibility, and that building food regulatory programs needs to rely heavily on partnerships between the various stakeholders, and particularly between those who are playing a big part in the food production system, so essentially those who produce food. And this is really across the supply chain, meaning from the primary production up to the retail level. There was also a strong emphasis to ensure that we need to invest in the awareness of consumers, and we need to empower consumers, because again, to be able to sustain the ability of industry to produce safe and quality food, we need to put in front of it a demand on the part of the consumer and an expectation on the part of consumer that needs to be supported by that level of awareness. If you increase the awareness and the food safety culture of consumers as to what they should be expecting in terms of safety and quality of food products, well, as a result, you will end up by a food production sector that will have to adapt to this particular demand. And of course, food regulators are part of this equation. They are, in fact, those who play that facilitation role between the food production sector and the consumers. And again, a lot of food regulatory capacity building programs have played a role in, for example, building the consumer awareness base. At the end of the day, the function of a food regulator is to have the oversight on the food production sector, but in doing so, in fact, the empowerment that they get is coming from an empowerment from consumers, because generally this empowerment is resulting from the food laws and from the various statutes that give those regulators the jurisdiction and the ability to exercise that oversight. So this has been really a positive area that we've witnessed in a number of food safety regulatory capacity building programs. Another element that we have observed is the recognition that the decision-making process on which food regulatory programs need to be based, so essentially the way food regulatory decisions are to be taken, particularly as they relate to food safety and nutrition, need to be based on the pillars of the risk analysis paradigm. So essentially ensuring that risk analysis is identified as a key driver for food regulatory decisions. And in fact, we have seen a number of food laws and food regulations written or rewritten with the acknowledgement that risk analysis needs to be the foundation of the decision-making process. Positive development as a result of these, and that is the fact that the food safety regulatory investments have been made to ensure that there is compliance with one of the first principles of the development and implementation of food control systems as it has been promulgated by Codex in 2013 through one of the pivotal texts of Codex that I consider actually pivotal in the context of providing guidance on how food control systems should be designed and should be implemented. The first principle really calls for the importance of food regulatory programs to have a coverage across the supply chain. So essentially to have coverage from the primary production up to the retail, up to what reaches consumers. And in fact, as a result, a number of these investments have been calling for either a re-engineering of the oversight and ensuring, in fact, that the oversight covers, by one single agency, the entire production chain from primary production up to the retail. So essentially, we have witnessed some changes in the mandate and the competencies of food regulatory agencies as a result of these investments. Or also, we have witnessed the development of more collaboration being advocated between various regulators. So essentially, if you have a system where you have a regulator, for example, for primary production and another regulator for processed products, well, there is really a strong emphasis to ensure that there is collaboration and partnership between these regulators. We have also witnessed a tremendous level of investment, and I would say here millions of dollars have been poured in food laboratory infrastructure. And this is really stemming from the fact that if you are to anchor food regulatory systems in risk analysis means essentially that you need to have scientific evaluation of facts, and you need for that data, and data generally for food may come from, in a significant manner from laboratory analysis, and that's why essentially there was this level of investment. And again, to be able also to accompany the new technologies that are out there, be able to identify emerging issues of food safety, being able also to address them with more, an agile type of response. And you wouldn't be able to do that unless you have the level of equipment, but also the level of competencies that are needed. Now, let's look at, for some of these areas, at some of the challenges or the areas of improvement that have been identified in attempting to make these investments. One of the first areas is essentially around that element of coverage of the entire food supply chain. And currently, when you look at a number of jurisdictions where either a re-engineering has taken place or there was a stronger emphasis on collaboration, you will note that there continues to be a struggle, I would call it still a struggle, in managing situations of shared mandate. So essentially, in other words, if you have, let's say, the Ministry of Agriculture in charge of the oversight on raw products or primary production, and you have a food regulator, let's say the Ministry of Health, for example, or another agency that was created in order to oversee the processed foods, the ability to have that collaboration is definitely impeded, and we are witnessing far more overlap and duplication of mandates. So essentially, we're seeing that when there is an intervention, you will find an intervention by two regulators, as opposed to essentially having really a clearly defined levels of responsibility, or in the context of shared responsibility, there is an understanding of the level of collaboration. And on the other hand, you will find some other areas that are completely not covered by the regulatory oversight. So essentially, you will have these fights of mandates, and this is in an environment where the food regulatory resources are constrained. So let me give you an example of a jurisdiction that I had the opportunity to work with. I have a jurisdiction where you have a newly created food regulatory agency with essentially the entire coverage as to the way the mandate has been exercised or is to be exercised. So essentially from primary production up to the retail. And of course, for the oversight on their animal-derived products, they need capacities and competencies in veterinary science. And on the other hand, you have from the original setup, or before essentially the creation of this agency, there was a ministry, and there is still a Ministry of Agriculture that has an animal health capacity and that has, of course, that veterinary science capacity and competencies. And upon the creation of the agency and upon essentially the re-engineering of the governance structure, we witness essentially that the food establishments that produce animal-derived food, they witness the oversight and the visit of both authorities. So essentially the Ministry of Agriculture using of course, the animal health mandate, but also still addressing some food safety requirements. And at the same time, you have the agency that is trying to develop, programs to oversee foods of animal origin, trying also to address the gaps in competencies in veterinary science, and instead of relying on the capacities and the competencies that exist in the jurisdiction that was exercising the mandate before, well, it is trying essentially to reinvest in it. So essentially, these areas of lack of collaboration still persist and actually constitute a strong hindrance to development. They can be resolved certainly by, I believe, the instillment of the notion of, well, there's far more to do than essentially the regulatory oversight that exists. So the fear of having the mandate stripped from you should not be your primary driver, and it tends to be in a lot of instances a driver in the way some of the decisions are made. And some of the ways to address that is also to progressively create systems of collaboration, to create almost mechanisms for systematic exchange between these organizations. And it also goes with some investment in culture shifts, and this, believe me, takes time. We know that it takes time even in organizations of so-called developed jurisdictions. So of course it will take even more time potentially in developing countries. So again, there is a need really to continue to invest in this area of instilling a culture of collaboration between the regulators and ensuring essentially that the regulators think mostly about the coverage of their oversight as opposed to what we call turf protection. So essentially, my mandate versus your mandate, and wanting to be the primary decision maker, and so on. So essentially, focusing on the outcome as opposed to focusing on oneself as an organization. Now, in a lot of instances, so we witness really these struggles continuing, and we witness also really a lack of understanding as to how the entire mandate of food oversight needs to be covered, and really the understanding that if you want to find a reference on that, one of the way to look at the references is really how the international organizations are set. Really to understand where the food mandate starts and where it finishes, one could argue actually to look at the mandate of the Codex Alimentarius Commission, where essentially it is the international food standard setter, and actually you can model the mandate of an organization or of food regulators using the mandate of Codex as a reference. The mandate of animal health is essentially could be modeled on the mandate of the International Animal Health Organization, or OIE, and the mandate of plant health could be modeled on the mandate and the coverage of IPPC, the International Plant Protection Convention Secretariat, and its role in standardizing plant health requirements. And of course, there is always a connection with the public health mandate, and particularly in areas related to the surveillance and the detection of diseases of food origin. And again, looking again at the that level of collaboration that needs to happen, particularly in the areas of disease surveillance, epidemiological information, and so on. So these tend to be potential good references if there is a struggle in identifying the limitations of the mandate and how essentially the interaction between food safety, food quality management versus animal health regulations versus plant health regulation, as well as the relationship with the public health mandate. Now, another element that continues to be an issue, and that is the realities of collaboration between partners. When I say between partners, between competent authorities and food businesses. So as I said in the beginning, yes, we have witnessed positive development in the acknowledgement of food competent authorities as part of their redesign or their enhancement processes, that they need to factor in a collaboration with food business operators and a collaboration even with consumers as well, and trying even to invest in consumer awareness. However, in a lot of instances, those aspects of collaborations remain more as part of slogans than they are really reflected on the ground as part of practices and as part of the way the food regulatory mandate is exercised. And an example of that, there are some reflexes that are not necessarily instilled and that need to be looked at in the context of these enhancements. So, for example, that whenever you have a food regulatory decisions, there needs to be an involvement of those who are producing the food, because at the end of the day, they are the ones who are going to be applying those new rules or those new decisions. Also, trying to promote the idea that in a lot of instances, food business operators, and particularly those who have invested in enhancing their practices, could be the source of the way those rules could be shaped. Because essentially, they know, particularly for those who have been educated and have invested in the way these operations should be, they have really a clear set of guidelines, particularly from international practices, as to how a number of food safety practices need to be designed and implemented. So rather than reinventing the wheel in terms of setting those new requirements, there is a need that any type of food regulatory requirements take into account the realities of the food business operators, and particularly where they have been making some investments in order to enhance their practices. Also, a need of an acknowledgement of full transparency that needs to be made, and actually supporting predictability. A food business operator cannot be operating in an environment where the regulator is totally unpredictable in terms of decisions being made at any point in time with different basis of decision making, processes, and without also that foundation of anchoring the decision in facts, in science. So again, even though the slogan of anchoring decisions in risk analysis to support really that systematic approach and to support more predictability, we are seeing gaps in the way that slogan is being really embraced in practice. And this is really coming in a lot of instances from limited competencies and the need to invest in the human competencies development, so essentially in talent development, and also in practically wiring the regulatory thinking in a way that it's clearly considering that a regulator's role is there to be a shepherd of the food business operator, a support to the food business operator, and not essentially to act primarily through enforcement actions. So essentially the role of the regulator is far more to accompany the food business operators than otherwise. And this notion is not necessarily well observed and well promoted in a number of jurisdictions that have been enhancing their food safety regulatory system. Another element that is quite common is also issues that we witness in the organization and in the governance. Now, we've seen new agencies being created or being re-engineered. We've seen new regulatory programs being set. And in a lot of instances, there is really a difficulty even to identify a clear designation of roles and responsibilities, having clear organizational charts. I have had the opportunity to intervene in a number of newly created food regulatory agencies. Until now, we're not seeing clear organizational charts. And there is also a tendency to have the decisions and the knowledge being concentrated in a few number of people versus the rest of the organization. So essentially the idea or the culture of building the organization, being able essentially to ensure that decisions cannot be made by individuals, but rather single individuals and independently from the rest of the organization, that you are rather building an organization and a program, and that you need to sustain those investments. And there is no way to do that unless you have a clear organizational structure. There is also a system of governance. So essentially, when I say system of governance, is clear indication of who decides what, and potentially support to that decision-making process, and support in the form of committees, in the form of advice being provided. So essentially systems that would allow to vet a number of decisions and to review them. And this is generally more conducive to robust and more predictable decisions, as opposed to individually made decisions that may be dependent, of course, on the personal appreciation of a problem, and therefore a personal indication as to what the right decision may be for a particular situation. In a lot of instances also, we find that there are gaps in the documentation of procedures and protocols, whether be it internally, so essentially that at the end of the day, the way regulatory operations are managed are not really related to the experience of the individual, but more according to well-documented processes such that they can survive the individuals, and essentially that should there be any transition or any change in the human competencies that are in charge, there will be still a good continuity with minimum hindrance and a minimum impact on the regular basically flow of activities. And the same thing would apply also to procedures and protocols in relation with the regulated parties. So essentially that it is very clear how the regulator would be interacting with the regulated party, particularly in the context of implementing enforcement decisions. So for example, when there is even an indication of a mandatory recall that needs to be made. The recall is still to be made by the industry, and how will that interaction going to be, managed? The way, for example, the interaction with third parties that might be intervening in supporting the exercising of the food regulatory mandate. So, for example, certification organizations and so on, and how is that defined in terms of their relationship with the regulator. So all that tends to be also missing. And in some instances, again, the way the flow of the information is managed tends to be impeded as well, and not very well clarified. So these are areas that need more attention, including in jurisdictions where there has been significant level of investment and a re-engineering of the capacity and the competencies. Another point also to mention is the fact that while the re-engineering of the programs tend to try to, build certain areas of food regulatory functions, like the standard setting functions, like the ability to, for example, exercise the oversight on the food business operators through, licensing and all the requirements associated with licensing, like imposing the adoption of prerequisite programs, the imposing of adoption of preventive control requirements, and so on. So even though there have been investment in discrete areas of food regulatory functions, I have witnessed that some key functions that support the decision-making process tend to be lacking. So for example, one of the examples that I have witnessed is a jurisdiction where there is a risk assessment department, so essentially a capacity that was built really to exercise risk assessment and that actually produces opinion. There is a standards department that tends to write the standards, but the linkages between the interpretation of the scientific opinion and making it into the development of options, such as the way standards are to be written, that element is still a gap. And you find that the standard department, in the way they are developing their decisions, they tend to be more focusing on what other jurisdictions did and essentially copying even some standards from European Union standards, US standards, Australia standards, and so on and so forth, without necessarily taking into account in a robust fashion the output of that scientific opinion and the development of options, the evaluations of these options, the try to foresee the impacts on the regulated sector prior to actually developing the standard. And rather than copying a standard and looking at how it would look like, it's essentially the opposite. So essentially you need to develop that food safety or nutrition standard based on the scientific opinion that you generated. But of course, at the end, benchmarking the decision on international decisions is a good practice, but it is at the end, not at that initial stage. So some of the functions there tend to be lacking, and this is something that I've witnessed in a number of jurisdictions. Another point that is important to note is really the level of understanding of what the function of the regulator is. And in a lot of instances, including in organizations that have been more recently developed, we witness that there is an understanding that the function of the regulator is mostly an enforcer. So essentially it's really to act as the stick, as the police, to go, to visit, to check, and essentially to punish. And that punishment is the right way really to to be able to address any type of requirements of the food industry and their enhancement practices. On the other hand, we know that essentially that the only way that you can sustain enhancement of the food safety practices and better compliance on the part of the regulated sector is essentially through compliance promotion. And really instilling that climate of fear between the regulator and the regulated party, and instilling that climate of police and so on in a lot of jurisdictions can also be conducive to situations that may lead to corruption, that may lead to arbitrary decisions, and so on. So, 2 points really that are important there, and that is, first of all, there needs to be a stronger focus on compliance promotion. And I go back to that same point that I mentioned earlier, which is that food regulatory requirements need to be based on the knowledge of what the industry has and what the industry can do, and even what the industry did. So you need to take into account the realities of the ground. Food regulatory decisions are meant really to support the enhancement of food safety practices of the regulated party, so they cannot be dissociated from that. And you cannot, as a regulator, hope that you will be achieving the objectives of your regulatory decision unless that decision is embraced by the industry. And there is no way that it gets embraced unless it is also well understood and that the industry understands the benefits of taking on those new practices to be able essentially to produce safer products, to be able to gain better trust on the part of consumers, to be able to gain better access to markets, and so on and so forth. So this notion of emphasizing on compliance promotion is really an element that needs to be further emphasized in investments in the enhancement of food regulatory systems. Another element also here is that in a lot of instances, when enforcement actions are taken, we note that even in newly redesigned organizations, a lot of decisions tend to focus on the decision of one individual, and that individual is the one that is simply in the one that is in contact with the regulated party. And that may be the case, or that might be good if essentially the decision is clear cut. But if the decision requires some kind of assessment of various parameters, putting the decision in an individual can lead to more arbitrary decisions and also some discrepancies in the decisions. And there is a need to create a practice of what we call incident management, particularly in the situations where you have various variables to be taken into account such that a decision of enforcement needs to be rendered. And there is a need to dissociate the person that essentially assesses the situation on the ground versus the person that, or the body or the group that makes the decision that needs to be implemented. And this dissociation has a number of benefits. First of all, the ability to ensure more systematic approaches and also more consistency in those type of decisions using the same type of parameters or variables. The creation of a history of a jurisprudence type, of compliance management and essentially enforcement decisions being developed. And the third benefit is also to ensure that you prevent the possibilities of corruption that may happen by putting the decision only in one person that is basically at the same time doing the assessment but also is going to be rendering a decision. And this is those notions of enhancing the element of compliance promotion, but also looking at the structure of an incident management that is more conducive for consistency, more systematic approaches, and also independence in the decision-making process. Those elements need to be further, looked at in the context of those investments. And another key element here that I would like to mention, and that is that in a lot of instances we have seen that despite the investment in re-engineering food safety regulatory systems, there is sometimes the notion that we forget that we are to operate really around a modern food safety approach that is more preventive than otherwise. We're still witnessing a number of food regulators focusing their decision making process on end product testing, on situations where I need a lab result in order to make a decision, and the lab result needs to be on the end products, and I'm going to be basically regulating my way, regulating food safety mostly through end product testing. And clearly the notion that a product that is tested to give you a result is a product that will not be consumed. And you have to ask yourself whether that product is truly representative of the reality of what is made available to consumers. On the other hand, focusing the attention on interventions that are really based on prevention, so prevention meaning really on reviewing the food production practices at the beginning, looking at really instilling those prerequisite programs, looking at making sure that preventive controls are adopted by food business operators, needing also to ensure that the responsibility of the food business operator is built such that they realize that it is their responsibility to demonstrate that they have identified the hazards associated with the production of their food, and that they have taken the measures necessary to mitigate those hazards. So this notion of shifting again from reaction and end product testing to prevention, more towards really ensuring the oversight on the production system, and even actually for imports to make sure that importers are more made aware of their responsibility to ensure that they verify the practices of their suppliers prior to making available a product on the domestic market. So essentially making sure that we shift towards prevention more, and we try to get more and more away from the notion of end product testing, as the basis of decision making is still an area requiring attention. And that's why we see a lot of emphasis. We need labs, we need labs because we need tests. Yes, labs are needed. Yes, laboratory data are needed, but in a lot of instances it's really for monitoring purposes, to provide you with data that will allow you to prioritize your action, to evaluate the performance of your food safety interventions as a regulator, but not necessarily as an element, as the key element upon which really a food regulatory system is being based. You may still need a laboratory result in order to confirm, a piece of evidence in the context of an investigation, but it will be only one piece of evidence. The other pieces of evidence related to the investigation of the establishment, to looking at the food production practices, and so on, are also key considerations that need to be complemented by that element of the laboratory analysis. The laboratory analysis alone should not be the basis of a decision-making process. Now, and I would like to just mention an area that is more at a higher level, and this is really the way capacity building initiatives, including those that are focused on enhancing food regulatory operations, are developed. In a lot of instances, we witness that for a number of reasons, because of the evaluation frameworks, because a lot of these capacity building programs are working with donor money. Of course, there are evaluation frameworks that are set, and we need, of course, to identify sort of the outputs and to identify the results in a practical manner. But we need to resist the notion of what I call counting beans, in terms of achievements, as opposed to really making sure that whatever output that is made that is developed is essentially producing the impact that we need. Investing in a laboratory operation buying equipment, buying reagents without investing in personnel competency, that would not be conducive to a strong impact. Also, investing, even if you invest in the labs, you invest in the personnel, you have data that is being generated according to good laboratory practices, not investing in the way that the laboratory data is going to be used, you are actually halfway through the impact that you are intending to produce in the food regulatory system. So really looking at the impacts of the decisions far more than the on singular outputs in the way these capacity building programs are designed, but also looking at the sustainability of the results. And in a lot of instances, we have witnessed investments in food safety regulatory programs of various jurisdictions in developing countries that when that initiative finishes, the entire program crumbles. That essentially tells you that this was not built on a robust foundation because essentially it is meant to continue without that continued support. So that element of sustainability needs to be looked at even more, even though again it is part of the considerations in the design of projects. But I haven't seen that this element is really producing the level of impacts that needs to happen. I've seen more the exception, happening rather than actually this situation being the rule. So more attention to sustainability of results and the impact to be produced on those food safety regulatory programs, needs to be made in the way food safety regulatory capacity building programs are set. I hope that these elements are useful to illustrate some of the limitations and also some of the perspectives of development, some of the opportunities. Let's be positive for the future. There's a lot that has been accomplished, but we need to also be paying attention to those elements that will make those investments more useful and hopefully more impactful for the production of safer foods and also for the development of stronger food and agri-food sectors around the world. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to be part of this program, and I wish you a continued good learning experience.